like, and make sure to engage in comments and share this video to your friends and story lovers, and click on the subscribe button on the screen to subscribe to Mortifacts for more real horror stories like this. They say you don't really know fear until it stares you straight in the face. For Andrew, a middle-aged CEO of a bustling medical insurance company, fear wasn't something he thought about much. He was a man of routine, control, and power. A luxury car, a well-pressed suit, and a secure high-rise office were the staples of his daily life. But one ordinary evening, on his way home from work, that sense of control began to crumble. Andrew was driving down the dimly lit stretch of road that connected his office to his suburban neighborhood, a route he'd taken hundreds of times. The city's skyline faded into the darkness behind him as he entered the quieter outskirts. As his tires hummed along the asphalt, he caught a glimpse of something in his rearview mirror, a car following him. At first, he thought nothing of it. It was Los Angeles. People drove at all hours. But something about this car felt off. It wasn't tailgating, but it wasn't keeping a natural distance either. It seemed to mimic his speed exactly, slowing down when he did, accelerating just enough to keep the same distance. Andrew told himself he was imagining things. After all, paranoia wasn't a good look for someone like him. But when he turned into his quiet, tree-lined neighborhood and saw the same car round the corner behind him, his chest tightened. He decided to test his theory. Instead of pulling into his driveway, he kept going, circling around the block. The car followed. Andrew's fingers gripped the steering wheel. His heart raced as he made another loop. Still, the car shadowed him. Andrew didn't go home that night. Instead, he drove straight to the police station. When he stepped out of his car, the other vehicle drove by slowly, almost mockingly, before disappearing into the night. He reported the incident, but the officer on duty wasn't particularly interested. Without a license plate or a solid description of the driver, there wasn't much they could do. It was probably just a coincidence, they told him. People got spooked all the time in a big city like this. But Andrew knew it wasn't a coincidence. Over the next few days, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He'd glance over his shoulder while walking to his car. He started to notice a figure lingering near his office building. A young man, mid-20s, with sharp features and dark eyes that seemed to pierce through him. He always kept his distance, but Andrew could feel his presence, like a weight pressing down on him. One evening, after a particularly long day at work, Andrew decided to confront the young man. He stepped out of his office, clutching his briefcase tightly, and walked straight toward him. "Can I help you?" Andrew asked, his voice firm but not unkind. The young man didn't reply. He just stared at Andrew with a faint, unsettling smirk before turning and walking away. Andrew couldn't sleep that night. He lay in bed, replaying the encounter over and over. Who was this man? What did he want? Why was he doing this? A week later, things escalated. Andrew began receiving anonymous texts. "I see you. Nice suit. Long day at work?" They were brief, cryptic, and undeniably personal. The worst part? They always came at moments when Andrew was alone, moments when he thought no one was watching. Andrew changed his phone number. He started taking different routes to work. He even hired a private security firm to install cameras around his house. But no matter what he did, the feeling of being hunted never went away. Then came the night that changed everything. That night, Andrew had a charity gala to attend. It was one of those lavish, obligatory events filled with polished smiles and small talk that he loathed. He left the event later than expected, tired but relieved to be heading home. As he pulled out of the parking garage, he caught a familiar sight in his mirror. A dark sedan, parked just far enough to be inconspicuous. His stomach churned, but he told himself it was just paranoia. Andrew wasn't sure when it started, but the car was back on his tail. It followed him through the bustling streets of downtown, out onto the freeway, and finally onto the quiet suburban roads leading home. His knuckles turned white against the steering wheel as he made an abrupt turn onto a side street. The car followed. He didn't go home. Instead, he drove aimlessly, zigzagging through unfamiliar streets, hoping to lose the car. But no matter how many sudden turns or detours he took, it stayed behind him like a shadow. Andrew's breath quickened. His world, once full of power and control, felt like it was shrinking. In a last-ditch effort, he sped up, weaving through the streets at a reckless speed. The sedan kept pace for a while, but eventually, its headlights disappeared. Relief washed over Andrew as he pulled into an empty parking lot to catch his breath. His pulse thudded in his ears, his chest rising and falling with every panicked breath. But the relief didn't last long. When he glanced at the entrance of the lot, the young man was there, standing in the shadows, watching him. Andrew's stomach dropped. How had he gotten here so quickly? And worse, how did he know where Andrew was going? Andrew locked his car doors, his mind racing for a solution. But the young man didn't approach. He simply stared, his expression unreadable, before vanishing back into the shadows. That night, Andrew barely slept. He sat in his home office watching the live feed from his security cameras. Every small movement, a swaying tree branch, a passing car, sent his heart into overdrive. It wasn't until nearly 3 a.m. that he noticed it, a figure walking down his street, slow and deliberate. It was him. Andrew watched as the young man stopped in front of his house. For a moment, he stood completely still, staring directly at the camera. Then, as if he knew Andrew was watching, he smiled. A chilling, toothy grin that sent shivers down Andrew's spine. Andrew called the police immediately, but by the time they arrived, the man was gone. The officers did a quick sweep of the area and assured Andrew that they'd patrol the neighborhood for the rest of the night. But their reassurances felt hollow. The next day, Andrew canceled all his meetings and stayed home, desperate to regain some sense of control. He spent the day glued to his cameras, obsessively checking every angle of his property. But as the hours dragged on, there was no sign of the young man. That evening, just as Andrew was beginning to let his guard down, the power went out. The house plunged into darkness, and the hum of the security system went silent. Andrew's heart raced as he fumbled for his phone, using its flashlight to navigate his way to the breaker box. As he made his way down the dark hallway, he heard it. A faint tapping sound. It was coming from the front door. Andrew froze, his breath hitching in his throat. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. Summoning what little courage he had left, he crept toward the door and peered through the peephole. There was no one there. Suddenly, the tapping shifted to the back door. then to the windows. It was everywhere, all at once. A symphony of dread that seemed to envelop the house. Andrew backed away, his phone trembling in his hand as he dialed 911. But before the call could connect, the tapping stopped. The silence was deafening, almost more terrifying than the noise. And then, just as Andrew thought it was over, he heard a voice, low, taunting, and unmistakably close. "Andrew," it whispered. Andrew's entire body froze at the sound of his name. The voice was too close, impossibly close. His heart pounded so violently, it felt like it might burst through his chest. He held his breath, straining to hear any movement, but the house had fallen eerily silent. His phone slipped from his trembling hands, clattering onto the floor. The sound seemed deafening in the stillness, but Andrew couldn't bring himself to pick it up. His eyes darted to the security monitor on the wall. The screen was black. No feed, no power, no safety. A creak echoed through the house, faint but deliberate. Andrew's eyes snapped toward the source, the staircase. He could feel the air shift, heavy and charged with an unseen presence. He wasn't alone anymore. He grabbed the nearest thing he could find, a heavy glass paperweight from his desk, and gripped it tightly. His palms were slick with sweat as he edged toward the staircase. The faint creak came again, this time closer. "Who's there?" he barked, trying to sound authoritative, but his voice cracked, betraying his fear. The silence answered him. Andrew's foot caught on the edge of the rug as he moved forward, and he stumbled slightly, his breathing shallow and erratic. He felt the weight of the darkness pressing in around him. And then, just as he reached the base of the stairs, he saw it. A faint shadow moving at the top of the landing. His throat tightened. The shadow was too tall, too human to be anything benign. And then, as if summoned by Andrew's fear, the young man stepped into view. He wasn't just a shadow anymore. He was real, solid, standing at the top of the stairs, looking down at Andrew with a gaze that sent shivers through his entire body. His face was calm, almost serene, but his eyes, they were alive with something dark, something dangerous. "How did you get in here?" Andrew demanded, his voice shaking. The young man tilted his head, a slow, deliberate movement that made Andrew feel like prey being studied by a predator. "I've always been here," he said softly, his voice carrying an edge of malice that made Andrew's skin crawl. Andrew took a step back, his grip tightening on the paperweight. "Stay away from me. I'll call the police." The young man chuckled, a low, chilling sound that echoed through the house. "Go ahead," he said, stepping onto the first stair. "They won't get here in time." Andrew's survival instincts kicked in, and he turned to run. But before he could take more than a few steps, the lights flickered back on, flooding the house with harsh brightness. He spun around, expecting the young man to still be there, but the staircase was empty. The house was silent once again, but Andrew knew better than to think it was over. He grabbed his phone off the floor and dialed 911, his fingers trembling so badly he could barely hit the buttons. The dispatcher's calm voice answered, but before Andrew could explain the situation, he heard it again, his name, whispered from somewhere behind him. He spun around, his heart pounding in his ears. The young man was there, standing in the doorway to the kitchen, a faint smirk playing on his lips. Andrew's voice cracked as he yelled into the phone, "He's here! Send someone now!" But before he could say anything more, the call disconnected. The line went dead. The young man took a slow step forward, his smile widening. "You've worked so hard to stay in control, Andrew, but you're not in control anymore." Andrew stumbled backward, his mind racing for a way out. He ran to the nearest door, fumbling with the lock, but his hands were shaking too much to open it. When he turned back, the young man was gone. The sound of footsteps echoed above him, deliberate and heavy. He wasn't alone in the house anymore, not just with the young man, but something else, something worse. Andrew's vision blurred with panic as the footsteps grew louder, closer, coming down the stairs. He clutched the paperweight like it was a lifeline, bracing himself for whatever was coming. And then the lights went out again, plunging the house into darkness. The last thing Andrew heard was his name, whispered one final time, before the sound of shattering glass filled the air. Click on the subscribe button on the screen to subscribe to Mort Effects for more real and true stories like this.